Earl Prudhomme had kept bees in Nottoway County, Missouri for 31 years by the time he first noticed the boy. He had seen people come into beekeeping from every direction: farmers who wanted pollination for their orchards, retirees who wanted a hobby that kept them moving, young couples who wanted raw honey for the kitchen. And he had learned, over those decades of watching, to read a person's relationship to the work from 20 feet away. You could see it in how they moved near the hives, whether they were nervous or patient, whether they were watching the bees or watching themselves. Earl had strong opinions about most things, and kept most of them to himself, which is the particular discipline of a man who has been wrong often enough to know the cost of talking too fast. He did not know, in the spring of 2014, that he was watching something he would still be talking about 9 years later. What he saw first was a rusted-out Ford Ranger, white, or what had been white, parked at the edge of the Milburn property on Route K. The truck had a bungee cord holding the tailgate half closed. Inside the bed, stacked on their sides with the covers lashed down, were 4 old Langstroth hive bodies, 10 frame deeps. The wood so weathered and gray, it was hard to say what color they had started as. 2 had obvious wax moth damage visible through the gaps in the aged lumber, the silken tunneling that meant the moths had been through the comb inside. A boy was carrying a 5th box from the barn toward the truck. He looked to be about 15. He was wearing a ball cap. No veil, no gloves, no jacket. He loaded the box in the bed without particular hurry, bungeed the tailgate back down, and stood there for a moment reading something written on the side of one of the hive bodies in black marker. Then he got in the truck and drove away north on Route K. Earl watched the truck go. He didn't say anything to anyone about it that day because there was nothing particular to say yet. He filed it. The way a careful person files something that doesn't make sense until later. There is a kind of person who knows something before they can explain it, and who stays quiet about it until the knowing becomes proof. If you've ever been that person, or watched one, hit subscribe. That's who this channel is for. It was the 3rd week of April 2014, in a pocket of northwest Missouri, where the spring comes slow and wet, and the fields carry the smell of turned black earth and old corn stubble for about 3 weeks before the ground firms enough to plant. The farms in Nottoway County ran mostly corn and soybeans, some hog operations on the eastern side of the county, a few row-crop farmers who kept a small cow-calf herd on the back pastures. Beekeeping was not a common occupation out there. A dozen serious hobbyists, maybe. 2 commercial operations. Earl Prudhomme's 48-hive apiary off the county road, and a man named Davis Hatch, who ran 60-some colonies and wasn't particularly interested in conversation. There was a feed store in Guilford run by a woman named Laverne Stotts, who stocked a small shelf of beekeeping supplies, smokers, hive tools, oxalic acid, 1 or 2 reference books, and who was generally where local hobbyists ended up when they had questions. Laverne pointed at the books. She said she wasn't the one who'd been keeping bees. The boy's name was Calvin Tesh. He was 16 that spring, not 15. Earl found out later he'd misjudged by a year. Calvin lived with his mother and his grandfather on a property 4 miles north of Guilford, where the grandfather, a man named Harold Tesh, had kept a small apiary until his hands had gotten bad enough that he couldn't work the frames without dropping things. Harold had sold his remaining strong colonies 2 years prior, 12 hives to a beekeeper in Atchison County, Kansas, and had shut the operation down. What he hadn't sold, because nobody had wanted to buy it, were the old, empty hive bodies stacked along the back wall of his equipment shed. 14 Langstroth deeps and 8 medium supers, sun-bleached. Some of the joints warped enough that daylight showed through the gaps, a few with dark old combs still inside that the wax moths had found over the winter. Calvin had asked his grandfather if he could have them. Harold Tesh said he didn't see why not. That was the whole conversation. Near enough. Harold was not a man who explained his reasoning at length, and Calvin had grown up knowing that most of Harold's reasons were visible if you watched instead of asked. Word spread through a small county the way it always spreads. Through the feed store, through the coffee corner at the co-op elevator, through the parking lots after Sunday morning services. By early May of 2014, it had gotten around that Harold Tesh's grandson was doing something peculiar, showing up at farms across the county wherever someone had abandoned a beekeeping operation, asking if he could haul off the old boxes. The reactions ran from mild bafflement to open amusement. Ray Stuckey, who ran a cow-calf operation in the southern part of the county and had tried beekeeping for 2 seasons before giving it up, told Laverne Stotts at the feed store that he'd handed the boy 6 old supers and 2 bottom boards so rotted you could push your thumb into the wood without much effort. Kid put them in the truck like they were worth something, Ray said. Laverne asked if the boy had paid him for them. He offered, Ray said. I told him no. The problem with old hive equipment, as any experienced beekeeper in Nottoway County would have explained to you without much prompting, was threefold. The wax moths, which tunneled through drawn comb and left it riddled with silk and frass. The small hive beetles, which moved in behind the moths and made whatever the moths had left worse. And the wood itself, which after enough winters without paint or proper treatment, warped at the joints in ways that threw off the bee space. The precise 3/8 of an inch between frames and walls that colonies needed to move freely, and that once it went off, led to burr comb, bridging between frames, and hives that were nearly impossible to inspect without doing damage. Equipment in that condition wasn't worth fixing, by any practical math. The comb inside was worse than the boxes. Black with age, moth-tunneled, contaminated. You could make a decent argument for burning it and buying new lumber and new plastic foundation before you could make an argument for hauling it home and putting hours into it. Earl Prudhomme had made that argument to himself 31 years' worth of times. He had made it about equipment just like what the boy was loading into that Ford Ranger. He figured he was right. He did not know what the boy was figuring. Calvin Tesh had grown up in that equipment shed. Not literally, but near enough. Harold kept the boy with him in the apiary from the time Calvin was 4 or 5 years old and could follow without stumbling. He didn't soften the experience. Calvin got stung the first summer and cried about it, and Harold waited and then handed him a hive tool and showed him where to pry the top cover. He got stung the second summer and didn't cry. By the time he was 10, he was pulling frames and reading brood patterns while Harold stood back and asked questions instead of answering them. Harold Tesh had been keeping bees since 1974. Started with 2 hives he'd bought from a man in Buchanan County and built everything else himself over the following years. Cut and glued his own boxes, rendered his own wax, split colonies by hand rather than buying new packages when he could avoid it. He kept records in composition notebooks, 1 per year, going back to 1977 when he decided his earlier notes hadn't been detailed enough. Laying patterns by hive, brood color, colony temperament notes, which hives were gentle, which were defensive, which ones followed you to the fence when you left. Honey production recorded by hive and by yard, which queens threw offspring that drifted back to neighboring hives and which didn't, which colonies had superseded their queens early, and what those daughter queens had looked like as layers. Over 38 years of keeping records that way, he had built a picture of what strong genetics looked like across generations of colonies. Not a theory, but 40 stacked notebooks of observed fact. He had handed Calvin that knowledge the same way he'd handed him a hive tool at 5 years old, without ceremony, without explaining what it was for. Drawn comb, Harold said to Calvin once, the boy was 10 or 11, is worth more than the bees that made it. Calvin asked why. Harold said to find the answer. Calvin spent the better part of 2 seasons finding it. What he found was this: drawn honeycomb. Comb that has already been built out from foundation into full hexagonal cells, used for brood or honey, and then emptied, is the single most valuable resource in a productive apiary. And it is also the resource most beekeepers underestimate, because it doesn't come with a price tag. Foundation, the wax or plastic sheet printed with the hexagonal cell pattern that bees used as a template, was cheap. $12 for a pack of 10 plastic frames with foundation installed. The problem was that drawing foundation into real comb cost the colony 8 pounds of honey consumed for every pound of beeswax produced. A new colony in a box of fresh foundation spent its first 4 to 6 weeks making wax rather than raising brood or storing nectar. It was burning the exact resource it needed to grow. A colony installed in a box of fully drawn comb skipped that phase entirely. The difference in a Missouri apiary, where the white clover and sweet clover flow peaked in June and was mostly finished by the middle of July, was 3 to 4 weeks of productive time. In a season that ran 10 useful weeks, 3 weeks was not nothing. Harold knew this. He had known it since the early 1980s, and his notebooks showed it in the production numbers. He had never thrown away good drawn comb in his life. Calvin knew it because Harold had made him find the answer himself, which meant he actually knew it, not as a fact he'd been told, but as a thing he had worked out and believed. When Harold's hands gave out, and the colonies were sold, and the equipment sat in the shed going gray, Calvin had looked at those old warped boxes and their moth-damaged frames the way Harold had taught him to look at everything in the apiary, not from the outside, but from the frame outward. He knew the boxes were bad. He also knew that bad and worthless were not the same number. Old dark brood comb, if the cell walls were intact, if the wax moth tunneling hadn't compromised the foundation beneath the wax, was cleanable. You froze the frames first, 48 hours in a chest freezer at 0 degrees, which killed the wax moth larvae and the eggs in the silk at the same time. Then you cleaned the debris from the cells, scraped the walls where the moths had worked, and inspected each frame for structural integrity. Frames with cell walls standing could go back into rotation. Frames where the foundation had been eaten through went to the burn pile. It was slow. Nobody did it commercially because the labor cost made no sense at any wage above about nothing per hour. But it could be done. Harold had done it with damaged frames twice in Calvin's memory, and Calvin had done it beside him. Calvin's time was worth whatever he decided it was worth. He was 16. He had a grandfather's 40 years of notebooks, a chest freezer in the shed, and the long evenings and weekends of a Northwest Missouri summer. By the end of August 2014, he had collected 22 hive bodies and 11 medium supers from 9 different farms, most of them free. 2 of them traded for a half-day of fence work and 1 afternoon of mowing. He had been through every frame. He had frozen the salvageable comb in 3 batches and cleaned it across 8 weekends, working through each frame the way Harold had shown him. Not fast, not sloppy, not skipping a frame because it looked like it might be okay. He repaired the worst of the box joints with exterior-grade wood glue and cedar shims, painted everything with 2 coats of exterior latex in a single flat white, and restacked the equipment in the back of the equipment shed with the salvaged comb reloaded inside. The whole material cost, counted out in his notebook, $47. Paint, glue, a new box of staples for the staple gun. He had functional hive bodies with drawn comb. What he did not have was bees. That was what brought him to Earl Prudhomme's gate on a Saturday morning in the second week of September 2014. Earl was in the apiary pulling honey supers off his late colonies when he heard someone at the gate. He looked up and saw the boy from Route K, the one with the rusted Ranger and the bungee cord tailgate, standing at the fence and waiting to be acknowledged. Not calling out, not rattling the gate, just waiting. Earl took his time coming over. Calvin introduced himself, told Earl whose grandson he was. Harold Tesch's name was known in Nottoway County beekeeping circles, and Earl nodded at it and asked whether Earl had any nucleus colonies he'd sell going into winter. A nucleus colony, a nuc, was a small starter colony, 4 or 5 frames of brood and bees, a mated queen already laying, enough stores to establish in a new box. Most beekeepers sold nucs in spring. A fall nuc was a different proposition. The colony went into winter smaller, with less stored honey, less time to build up, a narrower margin for error. Earl didn't sell fall nucs. He told Calvin so. Calvin asked why not. Earl explained the winter margin problem, the short time between installation and first hard frost, the energy cost of raising enough bees to form a viable winter cluster, the risk of the queen failing when there was no longer time in the season to replace her. It was a reasonable list of risks. Most people, Earl said, didn't try to start hives in fall in Missouri. Calvin listened. Then, he said that if a fall nuc went into a box of drawn comb, fully drawn, not foundation, the colony would skip the wax production phase entirely. It could put all its energy into brood and stores from the first week. With supplemental feeding, 2-to-1 sugar syrup run through October, it could build to a winter cluster population that was viable even off a late start. The drawn comb was the variable. Without it, he agreed with Earl. With it, he thought the math changed. Earl looked at the boy for a moment, not a long moment, just a moment. He asked where Calvin planned to get the drawn comb. Calvin told him, all of it. The farms, the freezer, the $47, the 8 weekends. Earl sold him 2 nucleus colonies at $115 each. He said later he wasn't sure why he did it, except that the boy had clearly thought it through, and Earl had a policy against arguing with thought. 2 nucs at $115 came to $230. Calvin paid in cash from an envelope in his jacket pocket. He loaded the nuc boxes in the Ranger at dusk, when the bees were all inside, and drove north on Route K. Earl watched the truck go. He figured there was maybe a 50-50 chance those colonies survived the winter in the hands of a 16-year-old working with patched-up equipment. He thought it was worth the 2 nucs to find out. The following April, he found out. Calvin came back to the gate in the first week of April 2015. Both colonies had wintered. He had pulled the entrance reducers in late March, and the populations were strong. He had brought photographs, the kind you take by holding your phone over the top of an open box, that showed wall-to-wall bees on 7 frames each. He had already started supplemental feeding to push the spring buildup. He wanted to talk about timing a split. Earl walked him through it. When to look for queen cells. How to judge the development stage of a capped queen cell. The timeline was 16 days from egg to emerged virgin, and you wanted to split before the first virgin queen hatched, or the colony would swarm, and the original beekeeper would lose half his population. How to move the old queen with 2 frames of brood into the new box with drawn comb. Calvin had that. And leave the queen cells in the original colony so the strongest virgin could emerge and mate. Calvin listened. He took notes in a small composition notebook he had in his back pocket. He came back in late May and told Earl he'd gotten 4 colonies out of the 2. The splits had worked. Both original colonies had raised new queens. He hadn't lost a single one. Earl nodded. He didn't say much. He said the boy had done the thing right. By July of 2015, Calvin had pulled his first real honey harvest. 94 pounds of clover and wildflower from 4 hives in a single yard behind the equipment shed. He sold it locally at $9.50 per pound, through Laverne Stotts at the feed store and through 2 churches in Guilford that bought it for their fall bazaars. 94 pounds at $9.50 came to $893. His total capital invested to that point was $277, the $47 in materials and the $230 in nucs. His equipment, 14 hive bodies, 8 supers, all the frames, had cost him $47 and 8 weekends of his own time. Most of the drawn comb, the thing that made the whole structure work, had been free. He is 26 years old now. He runs Tesh Apiary out of Nodaway County with 140 colonies across 4 outyards, a 2-frame honey extraction setup in a building he built himself behind Harold's old equipment shed, and a nucleus colony sales operation that moves between 80 and 120 nucs per year into a 3-state buyer list. He did not build the buyer list by advertising. The word had moved the way word moves when someone produces something consistently good. From one beekeeper to the next, quietly. His nucs had a reputation for wintering well. His queens had a reputation for being steady layers with low swarming tendency, which reflected 4 generations of selective splitting from Harold's original stock. People called and asked to be put on the list. He put them on the list and called them in spring when the nucs were ready. He still works with drawn comb the way Harold taught him to work with it. The inventory is deep now. A decade of splits and harvests has built a stock of well-cycled dark-brood comb that no amount of money could produce quickly. He replaces it on a rotation, cycling out the oldest frames after 5 or 6 years of use, doing it frame by frame the way he learned in his grandfather's shed. It is slow. He does it himself. He says the slowness is the point. Earl Prudhomme wound down his own apiary in 2021 when his wife's health made the physical work too much to manage between them. He sold off most of his colonies and kept 2 hives near the back of the property, which is what a beekeeper does when he can't quite stop. He had told the story of that April morning on Route K. The rusted ranger and the bungee cord and the boy carrying boxes in a ball cap without a veil, many times by then, to many different people. He told it the same way each time. He said the thing that had stuck with him was the lack of equipment, not the boxes. He meant the protective equipment. Most beginners are afraid of the bees, he said. You can see it in the bee suit, in the gloves, in the way a person's shoulders come up when a colony gets loud. The boy wasn't afraid. He moved the same way whether the bees were quiet or defensive. He had learned from someone who knew that if you gave the bees reason to trust you, most of the time they did. Earl said he didn't know for certain whether Calvin understood that morning on Route K what he was building toward, or if he was simply doing what Harold had taught him, that anything worth having in a beehive takes more time than most people will give it, and that the people who stop looking early are the reason the good things are still available to the people who don't. He thought it was probably both. He was not entirely sure those were 2 different things. Not every kind of knowing arrives whole. Not every lesson announces what it's for when it's given. Sometimes it is a man noting laying patterns in a composition notebook for 38 years because he believed specificity was a form of respect for the work. And sometimes it is a boy, 16 years old, carrying a box of rusted, wax moth damaged, half-rotted hive equipment across a barnyard without gloves, because someone had shown him, years before he needed to use it, how to look at something the world had written off and ask what the world had gotten wrong. The drawn comb had been there all along, inside boxes that 40 people across Nottoway County had decided were trash. Harold Tesh had known what it was worth. He had just run out of time to tell anyone but the one person who was listening. That turned out to be enough.